There is a place on this planet where 5,000 people are living inside a version of time that does not exist anywhere else on Earth, a constructed temporal reality engineered from scratch because the alternative, allowing time to behave the way it does on land, would cause the entire system to fail within weeks, and by fail, the meaning is precise, not inconvenience, not inefficiency, but the sequential collapse of operational functions that 5,000 people depend on to remain alive in the middle of an ocean with no external support structure within reach. If you were standing on the hangar deck of a nuclear carrier 70 days into a deployment with no coastline visible in any direction, no civilian internet connection, no bank, no external supply chain, no way to call for help that would arrive in time to matter, you would notice something that takes most people several days to consciously identify. You cannot tell what time it is from anything around you. The ocean provides no morning, the steel provides no evening. The sun, if visible at all through flight operations, is irrelevant to the schedule governing when you eat, when you sleep, when you work, and when you are allowed to stop. Time aboard a carrier is not measured, it is manufactured. And the question that this raises, the one that the entire architecture of the ship is built to answer, is how you engineer a functional relationship with time for 5,000 human beings when every natural mechanism those humans evolved to track time has been systematically removed by the environment they are operating inside. The first thing to understand about time on a carrier is that it has two simultaneous versions running in parallel, and the tension between them is not incidental. It is structural, built into the ship's operational design, because the alternative produces worse outcomes. The first version is clock time, the Greenwich-referenced, zone-adjusted numerical hour that governs communication schedules, coordination with fleet command, logistics windows, and any interaction the ship has with the external world. This version of time is stable, externally anchored, and non-negotiable. The second version is biological time, the internal circadian rhythm of 5,000 individual human nervous systems that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to synchronize with the 24-hour solar cycle, using light, temperature, meal timing, and social cues as the anchoring mechanisms that tell each body when to be alert and when to begin the neurological processes of sleep. On land, these two versions of time, clock and biological, roughly align, not perfectly, but closely enough that most people never notice they are two separate systems. On a carrier, they diverge immediately and continuously because the operational schedule is driven by mission requirements that have no biological logic, and because the natural cues that would normally keep the body's internal clock synchronized with the clock on the wall have been almost entirely eliminated. Managing that divergence, keeping it from becoming a gap wide enough to degrade the cognitive performance of the people running the ship, is one of the most complex human systems engineering problems the carrier solves every single day, invisibly through architecture most of its personnel never consciously examine. Here is what most people never consider when they imagine life aboard a carrier: the watch system, the structure that governs who is working and who is resting at any given moment, is not a schedule imposed on top of normal time. It is a replacement for normal time. When you live inside the watch system, the watch becomes your temporal unit. You do not think in terms of Tuesday or Wednesday morning or afternoon in any meaningful operational sense. You think in terms of your next watch, your last watch, how many hours remain before your relief arrives, how many hours of off time exist between now and when you must return to your station. This is not a cognitive adaptation that happens gradually. It happens within the first 2 weeks of deployment, and it happens because the ship's operational rhythm forces it. The carrier runs on a 24-hour clock, but does not run on a 24-hour human rhythm. Flight operations may run continuously for 18 hours, then pause, then resume. Maintenance windows are scheduled around aircraft readiness, not around human preference for daytime work. Reactor monitoring is a function that requires human presence at all times without exception, which means someone is always on watch at 3 in the morning reading instruments that must be read with the same precision as at 3 in the afternoon. The watch system distributes this continuous demand across the available workforce through rotation. But the rotation does not restore normal time. It creates a new temporal structure that is functional for the ship and disorienting for the body until the body stops expecting normal time and begins anticipating watch time instead. But this creates a new vulnerability, one that the ship's designers understood and built around, and that most civilians would not intuit from the outside. When the human body loses its synchronization with the 24-hour solar cycle, when the cues that anchor circadian rhythm are removed, it does not simply float in neutral. It begins to drift. The internal clock, deprived of external synchronization signals, runs on its own endogenous period, and which in most humans is slightly longer than 24 hours, meaning the body's natural tendency in the absence of external cues is to shift its sleep and wake preference slightly later each day. Over weeks and months, this drift is not trivial. A body that has drifted 2 or 3 hours from the ship's operational schedule is a body that is being asked to perform precision tasks during its internal biological night. And the performance consequences of that mismatch are measurable in reaction time, sustained attention, decision accuracy, and the speed at which errors are recognized and corrected. If you were a reactor technician whose circadian rhythm had drifted 3 hours out of phase with your watch assignment, you would not feel dangerously impaired. You would feel slightly sluggish, perhaps slightly slower than usual, entirely within what you would consider normal tiredness, and that subjective experience would be incorrect. Your instrument reading accuracy would have declined. Your threshold for noticing anomalous readings would have shifted. You would still be reading the instruments. You would simply be doing it with a nervous system operating at a measurably lower level of function than it was designed to sustain, in a compartment where the consequence of a missed instrument anomaly is not a performance review, but a reactor event on a ship 5,000 miles from the nearest port. This is where the ship's temporal engineering becomes something more than scheduling. The carrier manages circadian drift through a system of environmental controls that most personnel experience as simply the way the ship looks and feels, without recognizing them as active interventions in their own biology. Lighting aboard the carrier is not static. Common areas, mess decks, and high-traffic passageways are maintained at different light intensities across a cycle that is calibrated to the ship's operational schedule rather than to the position of the sun outside. High-intensity blue-spectrum lighting during periods when the largest number of personnel need to be alert suppresses melatonin production and advances circadian phase, pushing the body's internal clock toward the desired alignment with the watch schedule. Reduced intensity, warmer spectrum lighting during periods preceding major sleep windows allows melatonin to rise, facilitating the onset of sleep at the operationally correct time rather than at whatever time the body's drifting internal clock would prefer. Meal timing is structured with the same logic, not primarily for nutritional scheduling, but because the timing of food intake is one of the most powerful non-photic signals the human circadian system uses to anchor its phase. If you lived here, you would eat when the mess deck serves the meal, and the meal would be served at a time chosen in part because eating at that time sends a specific biological signal to your cells that this is the active phase of your cycle. The meal is not just food, it is a time cue delivered in macronutrients. Now picture what happens when the operational tempo accelerates. When the ship moves into a high readiness posture and the carefully engineered environmental time cues begin to compete with extended flight operations, around-the-clock maintenance requirements, and the kind of sustained activity that compresses sleep windows and disrupts meal timing simultaneously. This is the condition under which the ship's temporal architecture faces its most acute test, because the environmental controls that manage circadian alignment are passive. They work over days and weeks of consistent exposure, not over hours. A single extended operational period that disrupts the light cycle, delays meals by 3 hours, and cuts sleep windows from 6 hours to 4 does not immediately collapse anyone's circadian rhythm, but it deposits a deficit into the system that the passive controls must subsequently work to recover, and recovery takes longer than accumulation. 3 days of compressed sleep and disrupted light exposure during a surge operation may require a week of normal cycling to fully resolve. And the carrier does not typically have that week before the next operational requirement emerges. The temporal engineering system is therefore always operating against a background of partial deficit, managing the gap between biological ideal and operational reality, so that the gap never widens to the point where it produces failures the ship cannot absorb. And this is where the pressure intensifies, because the carrier's isolation removes every external resource that a civilian organization would use to manage sustained workforce fatigue. A hospital running short-staffed can call in personnel from home. A factory running extended shifts can offer overtime compensation that brings rested workers in from outside. An airline can ground flights when crew rest requirements are not met, accepting the operational delay as preferable to the safety risk. The carrier can do none of these things. The workforce is fixed. The mission does not pause for biological recovery. The ship cannot call for relief workers. The only resources available are the 5,000 people already aboard, their existing biological reserves, and the engineering systems built into the ship to manage those reserves as carefully as it manages its fuel. This is the design pressure that explains why temporal engineering on a carrier is not an amenity or a quality of life consideration. It is a force readiness problem. A ship whose crew has accumulated sufficient circadian disruption to degrade reaction times across multiple departments simultaneously is a ship whose actual operational capability is less than its stated operational capability. And the deficit is invisible in every metric except the ones measuring error rates, which only reveal the problem after it has already manifested as an incident. Here is where civilian logic collapses most completely. The civilian intuition about fatigue is that it is visible, that tired people look tired, move slower, make obviously impaired decisions that others can observe and correct. This intuition is accurate for extreme sleep deprivation, the kind that produces microsleeps and motor impairment. It is not accurate for the moderate chronic circadian disruption that is the actual operating condition aboard a carrier on extended deployment. Moderate circadian misalignment produces degradation in the cognitive functions that are hardest to observe from the outside and hardest for the affected individual to self-assess. Working memory, probabilistic judgment, the ability to integrate multiple data streams into a coherent situational picture. The threshold sensitivity that distinguishes a normal reading from a reading that is technically within parameters but trending in a direction that an alert technician would flag for attention. These are precisely the functions that the carrier's most critical stations require, and they are the functions that degrade first and most invisibly under circadian pressure. The ship's aviation medicine staff monitors for this degradation not through observation of individual behavior, but through structured cognitive assessments, aggregate performance metrics, and incident pattern analysis that can detect population-level drift before it reaches the threshold of individual observable impairment. The monitoring is predictive, not reactive. By the time circadian disruption is visible in individual behavior, the system has already been running at degraded capacity for days. The deepest layer of temporal engineering on a carrier is the one that addresses not just individual circadian alignment, but collective temporal coherence, the degree to which 5,000 people share a common experience of what phase of the cycle they are in, what is expected of them at this moment, and what the ship is collectively doing. This shared temporal experience is not a psychological nicety. It is an operational requirement. Because a ship where different departments are operating on significantly different effective time references, where the flight deck crew is mid-cycle alert while the engineering department is in biological early morning, is a ship where coordination degrades at the interfaces between those departments, where the assumptions each group makes about the other's readiness and responsiveness are systematically incorrect. Maintaining collective temporal coherence across a workforce running on staggered watches requires that the environmental time cues be consistent across the ship's common spaces, that the 1MC announcement schedule creates shared temporal anchors that everyone experiences simultaneously, regardless of their watch cycle, and that the rhythm of the ship's collective life, meal service, maintenance periods, the operational briefings, the sounds and activity levels that mark the ship's own version of morning and evening, be strong enough to override individual biological drift toward a shared temporal frame. If you were living here and that collective frame began to weaken, if the shared anchors became inconsistent, if the environmental controls fell into disrepair, if the operational rhythm fragmented under sustained pressure, you would not notice it immediately as temporal disorientation. You would notice it first as a subtle increase in coordination friction, in misunderstandings at watch handoffs, in decisions that seemed reasonable to the person making them but landed wrong with the person receiving them, because the two parties were, in a functional biological sense, on operating at different points in their cycle, and therefore with different cognitive states than either recognized. What this reveals about the aircraft carrier as a system is something that the ship's external appearance, its flight deck, its aircraft, its weapon systems, entirely obscures. The carrier is, at its operational core, a civilization-scale experiment in manufactured time, built around the recognition that human beings cannot function indefinitely inside an environment that removes every natural temporal anchor without replacing those anchors with engineered equivalents. The ship does not simply carry people and aircraft and fuel. It carries a complete artificial temporal environment calibrated to keep 5,000 circadian systems sufficiently aligned with operational requirements to sustain mission capability across months of isolation from every external reference the human body evolved to depend on. The light systems, the meal schedules, the watch rotations, the acoustic environment of the common spaces, the collective rhythms of operational life, all of it is infrastructure, as load-bearing as the hull and as carefully engineered as the reactor plant, because without it, the humans running the ship would begin to drift apart from each other and from the ship's operational clock in ways that the mission cannot absorb. The carrier does not fight time. It builds a replacement for it and installs it in the daily experience of everyone aboard. So completely and so seamlessly that most of them never recognize they are living inside a constructed temporal reality rather than a natural one. What has not been examined here is what happens to that constructed temporal reality when the ship enters full communications blackout, when the last external time reference, the coordinated universal time signal that synchronizes the ship's master clocks with the rest of the world, goes dark, and the carrier must sustain its engineered version of time from entirely internal resources, with no external correction available, and no way to know how far its internal temporal architecture has drifted from the world it left behind.